What does it mean to be enchanted? Enchantment is a state of awe and wonder, drawing us into the mystery of the world and cosmos, guided by our feelings, intuition, and senses. In The Gay Science, philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche boldly stated, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent?" Nietzsche's piercing vision prophesies the culture of disenchantment, where awe and wonder are associated with immaturity, irrationality, or magical thinking, and rationality and knowing rule supreme. Science introduced many of the developments essential for modern living, but at what cost? This installment of Archetypes of Awakening will explore the impact of disenchantment through the shadow polarities of the artist archetype. We will make a case that the artist archetype is a vehicle for re-enchantment with the world, supporting the ongoing quest to heal, individually and collectively. In its healthy expression, the artist represents our ability to allow our senses and intuition to open the imagination, to harness the power of creativity, to represent the inner workings of the unconscious, to reveal truths ungraspable by the rational mind. Such truths can encourage us to reach for a more humane, egalitarian, and caring vision of the world, and indeed provide a means to transcend the personal ego that might otherwise consider itself alone and abandoned. As we've touched upon in earlier installments, the nature of archetypes is fluid. There are no fixed examples, but ever-moving patterns. Many of the overlapping qualities of archetypes are explained by Carl Jung's psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. In The Magician, we explained how the shadow polarity of the detached manipulator is the result of disconnect from the feeling function. Artists too can be disconnected from their feeling function, or overwhelmed as a result of being flooded with sense impressions from intuitive realms. The artist's shadow polarities can manifest behaviourally and philosophically. Naturally, the two are interrelated. Someone's inner stance will affect their behaviour. Behaviourally, the active shadow is hedonism, an excess of sensory indulgence. Philosophically, the active shadow is pollyannaism, where the realities of the world are sugar-coated by excessive optimism or positive thinking. Behaviourally, the passive shadow is asceticism, a denial of the senses that may venture into masochism. A common variation of this shadow expression is the starving artist. Philosophically, the passive shadow is nihilism, a particularly bleak, uninspired, and meaningless view of reality. Sadly, sometimes the shadow polarities become enmeshed. The nihilistic hedonist, by example, will pursue pleasure at any cost without concern for the consequences, because of a deep-seated belief the world is moribund and meaningless. As we will know, these polarities play out in the form of various addictions, means of escape, and misguided antidotes in the form of self-denial. Addictions aren't always obvious or extreme, such as alcohol or heroin, but any compulsive behaviour, including attachment to thinking patterns and emotions, which nonetheless leave us disconnected and disempowered. In the late 1600s to early 1800s, the Age of Enlightenment established the scientific method guided by the rational mind. Whilst much has clearly been gained by advances of science and rationality, the process inadvertently severed the sacred connection to invisible realms, the unseen transpersonal dimensions where one can find refuge, inspiration, and ultimately true freedom. With a well-intentioned desire for liberty and reason, the Age of Enlightenment rightfully challenged religious dogma and control, and supported a necessary separation from the church and the state. However, in the drive to overcome the supernatural, there was no longer space for the spiritual or divine. As sociologist Max Weber notes, the Age of Enlightenment caused a process of De-Magic-Ation. From the German Entzauberung, De-Magic-Ation involves stripping away mystery, disconnecting from the animating principles of reality, the symbolic, the enchanted, beyond rationality or logic, or even comprehension. Nature and its mystery is reduced into a problem to be solved. Skepticism and suspicion prevail. Materialism has outjostled the immaterial. As the Age of Enlightenment became synonymous with capitalism and industrial society, its position as the predominant worldview was firmly cemented. Indeed, science appears effective in conquering nature, curing disease, establishing civilizational infrastructure, and materializing the social contract to bring the greatest good to the greatest number. Like many powerful ideologies, Enlightenment principles have become their own dogma. A human existence objectified, assessed, numbered, analysed, and organised, no differently from an atom or molecule, becomes increasingly nihilistic. The grind of day-to-day work in existence, not dissimilar to the asceticism of a medieval monk. All the while, the wealthiest 0.1% continue to live gilded lives, cushioned from the harsh reality of daily existence. However, as disenchantment tightened its vice-like grip, counter-movements pushed back. Philosopher Baruch Spinoza's pantheism reanimated the world through the transcendent miracle of nature. Romantic poets and writers sought to reveal beauty in truth, and truth in beauty. The Western transcendental philosophical movement sought to reintegrate the lost qualities of the Enlightenment through a sacred connection to invisible dimensions, through the senses. Throughout, artists have attempted to reflect the impact of disenchantment. Paintings like Turner's Age of Speed showed the pace of industrial progress juxtaposed against nature, and then the Impressionists revealed the vitality behind human life and nature. Later movements, like Cubism, used abstract art to reflect disconnection. The Dadaists sought to reflect the nonsensical nature of man's self-destruction in World War I. Picasso's most famous painting combined elements of Cubism and Surrealism to reveal the pain and horror of the Nazis' bombing of the Basque village Guernica on behalf of the Spanish dictator Franco. Visionary artists such as those mentioned see beyond the visible and penetrate deeper layers of meaning. But art in its crudest form can be created without visionary genius, remaining superficial, reflecting only visible realms, neglecting innovation or originality. Art without deeper meaning embalms us in a hyper-reality, divorced from real human experience. Even art itself can be divorced from its original conception, only experienced through reproduction or imitation, its original transformative power diluted or commodified. However, when art connects to a lost power within, people respond, often without knowing why. Stravinsky's 1913 ballet performance of The Rite of Spring is an infamous example. As the story goes, Stravinsky's brutal and provocative creation ignited a riot, its primal aliveness evoking an overwhelming energy the audience weren't prepared for. The reigning economic system is a vicious circle of isolation. Its technologies are based on isolation, and they contribute to that same isolation. From automobiles to television, the goods that the spectacular system chooses to produce also serve it as weapons for constantly reinforcing the conditions that engender lonely crowds. Guy Debord, The Society of the Spectacle. There are two sides to art, the creator and the consumer. Deprived of the ability to use our senses to access the healthy function of the artist archetype, we must rely on a wide range of entertainment to stimulate us. And as the French word for entertainment, divertissement, suggests, to divert our attention. The news media is prone to report disaster after disaster, to broadcast a worldview that keeps us permanently anxious and happy to accept an unexamined and pacified existence, while simultaneously dismissing alternative ways of living. Two potent works of fiction in the last century reflect this process clearly. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World points towards the hedonist and Pollyanna shadow expression of the artist archetype. Written in 1932, it depicts a society in which soma, a drug made freely available by the government, produces a chemical hit to keep the masses happy yet passive, too numb to protest or express themselves. Huxley captures how indulgence in the senses can become greed and excessive consumption, where life is shaped by the addictive need for dopamine hits, pacified by a veneer of superficial happiness. Behaviour is influenced by the craving for a sensory high, and motivation to seek the fruits of enchantment, such as fulfillment, truth, or purpose, is lost. By contrast, George Orwell's 1984 points towards the passive shadow of asceticism. Written in 1948, Orwell explores the negation of the self via a society that forces a nihilistic and homogenized way of living upon its population, with any desire for self-expression heavily policed, controlled, and stamped out. Orwell's dystopia, force-fed by an increasingly paranoid, centralized, and bureaucratic state, naturally leads to nihilism and apathy. In what ways do you see Huxley's pacification through sensory highs, or Orwell's denial of self-expression through tyrannical power, exemplified in modern culture? The ultimate cost of disenchantment is articulated by Johann Hari's Lost Connections, which views the mental health crises through various modes of disconnect, from meaningful work, social connections, meaningful values, and the natural world. Overwhelmed, overstimulated, and overinformed, our inability to make meaning in the hyperworld leads to a burnout of some senses and the underdevelopment of others. Sensitivity becomes calloused. It takes more stimulation to feel, leading to addictive behaviour, craving bigger and more intense experiences, from dietary sugars to sounds and sights and intellectual drama or heightened emotional states. Nobel Prize-winning ethologist Niklas Tinbergen coined the term supernormal stimuli to describe this adaptation. Experimenting with animals, he noticed how superficial, exaggerated markers became more attractive than their natural counterparts. For example, male butterflies chose to mate with wooden butterfly models with extra defined markings. As much as we desire to be separate from nature, this hijacking of instinct also applies to the human so-called lizard brain, the evolutionary relic from our ancestors. The tragic irony is that the supernormal stimulation of technology and consumerism dulls sensitivity to nature's normal range of stimulation. Enchantment is discovered not on screens or through technology, but by becoming mindful of the world's subtle brilliance. As sensitivity is rediscovered, the apparent mundane is reanimated with mystery. Integrating the artist archetype is a process of trial and error. When we step fully into one polarity, we may find ourselves inadvertently swinging to the opposite extreme. For example, becoming aware of hedonistic behaviour may lead to the belief that the only solution is to go cold turkey by shaming or denying the senses completely. Renunciation is a spiritual practice, a way to cleanse the palate in order to cultivate the sensitivity to connect to the truth within. However, too much restriction creates its own issues. Asceticism isn't the lasting solution. As Siddhartha, the Buddha, discovered, between indulgence and avoidance lies the middle way. And what about the philosophical structure that fuels the polarities? Pollyannaism is a fantasy that lacks grounding in reason. The integrated artist doesn't reject reason and rationality, but blends it with a much richer palette of sense and intuition. Nihilism is also overcome by this blending process, transforming into healthy skepticism or stoicism. Awareness of your personal tendencies is the first step on the path of balance. The hedonist may be encouraged to withdraw senses moderately, avoiding pure asceticism. For the ascetic, the renunciate who has revoked the world, the key is reconnecting to the rhythm and flow of nature, not seeing themselves as separate from the senses, but embedded within them. Philosophically, pollyannaism needs the counterweight of rationality, a reality check to accommodate a vast perspective of the world, beyond black or white thinking. Nihilism needs the counterweight of imagination and inspiration, an injection of meaning that is depthly found beyond the surface. It is generally the creative artist who creates the future. A civilization that has no creative people is doomed, so the person who is really in touch with the future, with the germs of the future, is the creative personality. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jungian analyst. Artists hold a vision for the collective which touches a deeper truth, tapping into the sensing and intuition functions and translating them in a way that allows others to see that truth, usually bypassing the analytical and rational mind. Why is it that so often great works of fiction ignite and inspire, stirring feelings within that feel familiar yet distant, evoked and yet always dormant, waiting for that outlet to express? There is a risk of using fantasy to escape, to avoid facing the facts or ignoring reality. When harnessed consciously, artists don't only sculpt the future, but, to use a metaphorical truth, make sense of the world, expressing ideas, myths, and symbols beyond conventional language or limited concepts, swimming in the metaphorical, poetic, archetypal worlds, talking the language of dreams and vision. This ability might manifest as a visionary such as Huxley, whose immersion into the psychedelic experience was expressed with great lucidity in his writing, or Orwell's piercing rational analysis, accompanied by an intuitive seeing and satirical representation of cultural patterns. As we close, it's important to acknowledge the misconception that creativity is reserved for artistic expression. Creative living is a pathway to empowerment. Creative living is the capacity to sculpt life from the inside out, to create from circumstance, rather than being a victim of circumstance. Creative living represents the capacity to paint the future, rather than allow society to impose a paint-by-numbers approach to living.